Hello and welcome to this class on how people make decisions. And that's a significant subject, as without understanding how people make decisions, we can't possibly influence their decision-making process. In this lesson, we're going to explore 4 characteristics of our decision-making process, starting with the most important, that we, when it comes to it, are inherently lazy in our decision-making. We make thousands of decisions every day, so it's hardly surprising. And most of those decisions, to be honest, are pretty easy. They're decisions like, shall I have a drink? What pair of socks shall I put on this morning? And do I respond to that notification on my phone? These types of decisions are primarily automatic and unconscious. In most cases, we aren't even aware that we're making them. If you've watched my class on how the brain works, you'll know that these decisions are handled by a mental process that I referred to as System 1. But more challenging decisions, such as which laptop to buy or where I should eat out, are harder to answer, and so are decided as a conscious choice. As I said in a previous lesson, psychologists refer to this as System 2. The problem is that System 2 thinking is hard work, and so we tend to avoid it. Instead of waking up System 2, System 1 will just substitute a challenging decision with a simpler one. That's why it can be so hard to diet. Counting calories is hard and requires System 2 to be fully engaged. Instead, System 1 prefers just to simplify the question of what food would be most healthy for me to eat right now with a simpler question like, am I hungry or do I like this food? Of course, most of the choices we want people to make on our sites are harder decisions. Decisions about whether to make a purchase or sign up for your newsletter. So when faced with these kinds of decisions, if left to its own devices, System 1 will either substitute the decision of signing up to your newsletter with a question like, do I want to get spam? Or it'll give up entirely. There are 2 things we can do to avoid this problem. First, we can simplify the question for people by emphasizing the positive benefits of signing up to the newsletter. For example, let's say you've sold sports equipment. If you ask people to sign up to their newsletter, then they have to weigh the pros and cons of that decision. But if you say sign up to get fitter, System 1 can easily answer the question, would I like to get fitter? Second, if we can't control how the question gets simplified, we can at least address that simplification or any objections associated with it. In other words, immediately alongside the call to action to sign up to a newsletter, we need to make it very clear that we won't be spamming people and how often they can expect to hear from us. That way users don't ask the question, do I want to get spammed? But there are other ways we can help people decide without them having to think too hard. One of those ways is to make sure that we consider the user's perception of the situation. Because we're inherently lazy, System 1 tends to ignore information that's not immediately at its disposal and instead creates a story that seems plausible based on what it knows. That means we can easily misinterpret what's going on as we jump to conclusions. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I work with a lot of universities, and one of their goals is to encourage overseas student recruitment. In student interviews, we discovered that many of the students were actually discouraged from attending some institutions because they didn't see photographs of people like them from their ethnic background on the website. They therefore concluded that this wasn't a place for people like them. As you can see, that's a big problem. They didn't stop to ask themselves whether they had all the facts. They made a judgment based on what was in front of them. We can counterbalance these kinds of misconceptions by priming users to shape what their perception is. We can use priming in all kinds of ways to influence behavior. For example, in experiments, supermarkets found that if they played French music in a store, they increased the likelihood of French wine being sold and reduced sales of wine from other countries. The principle of priming has some interesting ramifications for us as web designers, not all of which are particularly ethical. But we can use priming for good too, and it's already happening on our websites whether we like it or not, as was shown from the example with the students. We can use it to prepare people for their experience and give them the right impression of our website. We've already talked about how photography can be used to prime students' perceptions, but our imagery is not the only tool at our disposal. Color is another powerful priming tool as well, because we associate different colors with different emotions and behavior. For example, at the most basic level, users in Western countries will be less likely to click a red button than a green one because we've been conditioned to associate red with danger. We can also use layout to prime user expectations. Larger, more prominent elements will be seen as more significant and so will be given more attention. In fact, there are all kinds of ways we can prime users, from the associations we make with the products to the number of times we feature a product prominently on our site. For example, associating your product with a happy, smiling person primes users, at a subconscious level at least, to expect the product to make them happy. Equally, showing a product multiple times primes them to consider your product as significant. Of course, this can be dangerous too. Priming can set up false expectations. If you prime people to think that your product will deliver a specific result and it fails to do so, that can prove damaging, as we will discuss in other lessons. Talking of other lessons, I also later on dive into the subject of social proof and how that encourages action. However, it would be remiss of me at this stage not to at least mention the influence of others on our decision-making process. One of the substitutions we make all the time when making complex decisions is to ask ourselves, what would other people do? It's easier to rely on other people's judgment than it is to make a considered, informed decision ourselves. And that's particularly true with more complex choices. For example, when faced with a series of very similar options, we tend to go with the decision that is considered the most popular, that most people have gone for. And that's where ratings, reviews, and testimonials become critical for our website. But we get into that in another lesson. For now, all you need to understand is that other people have a massive impact on our decision making, and that we can use that to give people confidence in the decision they're making. It's important to stress that the goal here is not to manipulate people into making a particular decision. As I've already said in this lesson and will emphasize throughout the whole of this course, that's ultimately damaging to your business over the long term. Instead, we're seeking to help somebody make a fast, informed decision that leaves them confident in their choice. It's that confidence that matters. We want people to make a fast decision, not because we want to rush them into buying, but because the longer they take to make a decision, the less confidence they will have in it. And a lack of confidence will either lead the user to abandon the decision entirely or go into the decision primed to believe they're making the wrong choice. And that increases the likelihood of them being unhappy with the result of their decision. Unhappy decisions are bad for business. They lead to more unsubscribes, more buyer's remorse, more returns, and more complaints. And that's why it's crucial to help users make sound decisions that they're confident in. And to do that, we need a better understanding of the users themselves. But that is a subject for another lesson. For now, thanks for watching.